This program was made possible by the Florida Humanities Council. We come from all over, and we become one state, where we share in the history and become part of the culture that is Florida. The Florida Humanities Council, bringing Floridians together by sharing the stories of our state. And by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Additional funding for preserving our waters is provided by the beaches of Fort Myers and SANIBEL and by the Charlotte Harbor National Estuary Program.
Support for WGCU's local productions comes from the estate of Patrick and Rosalie LaSala and from generous contributions by viewers like you. Thank you.
Here on the backside of Fort Myers Beach is one of Florida's most productive and serene estuaries. When you're back in the mangroves and you're out of sight of the condos and the high-rises, it can seem like the bay has changed little since the native Calusa Indians were here. But Estero Bay could have evolved very differently. A plan was on the table to remove mangroves and seagrasses along the bay's coastline and replace them with seawalls, paving the way for canals and development. That was more than 50 years ago when a group of Lee County residents had a vision about the future of Estero Bay. That moment in time in the 1960s was pivotal in the environmental movement. Silent Spring was published in 1962. Apollo 8 gave us Earthrise, our first view of Earth from space. And the first Earth Day was in 1970. In the middle of all of that, Lee County residents drove the creation of what would become the first aquatic preserve in Florida. Their vision was that submerged lands and the water on top of them belongs to all of us. I'm Win Everham, Professor of Marine and Ecological Sciences at Florida Gulf Coast University, and I've been studying and teaching about Estero Bay for 20 years. This is the story of preserving our waters, 50 years of the Estero Bay Aquatic Preserve. Lifelong resident of Lee County, Bill Meller, was a leader in creating that vision for Estero Bay. And you were born here in Lee County?
Born right here in Fort Myers, down on Fowler Street. People ask me where you're from, and I say Fowler Street.
You must have got out on the bay when you were young.
I guess one of my first times down here would be out in 1937. We liked to come here to Estero Bay to spend the weekends. Back then, the water was beautifully clear, and the fish were in here just unlimited. There's just unlimited amount of fish in there.
When you guys started the LCCA, that was in the 50s, right?
Yeah, Lee County Conservation Association, yeah. And that was when we first heard this proposal to come in and turn all of Estero Bay into a city of about 8,000 or 9,000 people. Up until then, there'd been an awful lot of dredging up of bays and that sort of thing. And one of the very worst was Boca Bay up at St. Petersburg. They just dredged up the entire bay up there and destroyed it. And when all this was proposed, we all realized that could be a disaster. So there was arranged, a whole group met and decided that this was going to be a joint effort. So that was where Lee County Conservation Association was born, out of those meetings there.
At one point, the LCCA had membership numbers greater than 50% of the registered voters in Lee County. That gave them a voice that got local and state representatives listening. Why do you think they all got involved? They knew how important it was to protect the bay?
It created a real stir, and a lot of people brought it to their attention, and they began to realize that if we did not preserve some of this, the estuary areas, the estuary is the factory that manufactures your fish. And you destroy those, and you won't see any more snook or redfish. You'll cut them way down. So,
not everyone was in favor of an aquatic preserve. Private landowners and developers had purchased land with the anticipation of making a large return on their investment. The aquatic preserve would mean that they could not clear the mangroves and establish waterfront property.
We thought we had things pretty much under control until some years, and then All of a sudden we wound up and we found out it wasn't, simply making the argument on the basis that, gee whiz, a lot of our food comes out of it, good for fishing. We realized it had to go more than that. So several of us, including myself, began to study law.
The legal context goes back over 100 years, with laws changing from requiring landowners to improve their shoreline with filling and bulkheads to laws that place those submerged lands as a public trust.
Well, it wasn't until we could actually sit down and cite law that they took us seriously. We managed to get the aquatic preserve, Estero Bay, declared an aquatic preserve, which was a new thing. And after we got that done, there were other people all around the state. Until today, there are 41 aquatic preserves all around the state now.
So as you guys were fighting that for 8 years, was there moments where you said, we might not make it?
Well, there was always a battle going on, but never at any point did anyone ever feel like they're going to quit and give up.
Do you ever remember thinking when you were fighting this 50 years ago, did you have a sense of what you wanted the bay to look like in 50 years? Is it there?
I wanted to look exactly like it did 50 years ago. That was the point of it.
I don't know if I've ever talked to anybody who's been here as long as you have, but people who've been here 30 years, 40 years, mostly talk about it's not as good as it used to be, rather than it's a lot better than it might have been.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's not nearly as good as it was when I was just a little kid, because the waters were so much more beautiful, clear then. It's like the water down at Key West. This was beautiful, clear water. You can see bottom and clear see bottom in 6 feet of water.
Do you see other leadership emerging? Do you see other people who care the way you do?
Oh, yes. I think this, for instance, this Estero Bay Buddies, we are seeing that sort of thing appear in other places too. So I think it will be carried on. But you have to watch it all the time. It's one of those cases where you have to win every battle. You lose one, and you can't reverse it.
It's very important in any case to have a persistence of vision. None of these things happened rapidly. The reason we have Estero Bay protected today, and the reason we have the conservation lands we have, and the reason we have a chance to improve the situation, make it better, is because of persistence of people over decades. And you just have to continue to try to protect that thing which you value the most, which is the quality of life that makes Florida, Florida, and Estero Bay the unique gem that it is for Lee County.
Estero Bay was the first preserve, and it was because of the citizens of Estero Bay that it was even established. And I think once citizens across the state were seeing what Estero Bay was doing, they wanted to preserve the submerged lands that were special to them. And so a special task force was established. They looked across the state. They identified 26 areas that they thought needed additional protections. And that really was the foundation for the network, because it was after those 26 areas were recommended to be established as aquatic preserves that the Aquatic Preserve Act was passed in 1975. And that was the start of the system. And today we have 41 aquatic preserves, 2.2 million acres are being set aside for management, to benefit everybody.
Here on Mound Key, we can see remnants of the Calusa Nation. They farmed the estuary and as the result, built a healthy economy and a vibrant culture.
Well, Estero Bay is essentially ground zero for early Spanish contact with the Calusa, which was the most powerful group of Native Americans in all of South Florida. And so literally right from the first contact with Juan Ponce de Leon in 1513, what was known as the Bay of Carlos, or now Estero Bay, was a major point of interaction between Europeans and Calusa. Well, it's not just a coincidence that Mound Key was the capital of this vast Calusa domain. It held apparently about 1,000 residents on that one island at the time of the Spanish contact. And so that tells us a lot about the fact that Estero Bay was hugely productive and could support large numbers of people. So Estero Bay itself is just one of the most productive landscapes and waterscapes in all of South Florida.
What if the Spanish had never come to this coast? Would the Calusa still rule? Only if they had continued to be good stewards. Their whole society was based on maintaining a healthy and productive estuary. Commercial fishermen also appreciated the bay's productivity, and many families settled here to make a living off the fertile waters of Estero Bay.
My grandparents were Mamie and Drain Weeks. They settled this on Estero Bay. In 1923, they moved down here. And then they really opened up for the marina and all that to enjoy the Estero Bay and make a living off of it. It was always called Weeks Fish Camp. It was a commercial fishing village. It wasn't an angler village. We all made a living commercially off the bay. They'd catch trout, they'd catch sand brim, a lot of stuff, but the mainstay was mullet. They can always catch mullet and have enough to eat. I mean, it was a mainstay of Southwest Florida. Granddaddy, when he bought the property here at Weeks Fish Camp and decided to make a commercial fishing out of it, he never wanted to let this property go out of the family name because they can always at least come here and catch fish in the bay and feed their families no matter what happened with the Depression again or anything else. At least we had a way of feeding our families. The fishing in the bay was really plentiful. A good fisherman like the Johnsons, we would go out at night and we'd average 3,000, 3,500 pounds a night per boat fishing for them in the good times. My dad and his brothers, they would try to become entrepreneurs. They'd gather up all the fiddler crabs they could, and they had a sign sitting there saying, "Fiddler crabs for sale, see the Weeks boys." So they tried to sell anything that we could do to make money back then and stay doing what we love to do out here.
When it was first established, the Estero Bay Aquatic Preserve protected the submerged lands just south of Matanzas Pass to Big Carlos Pass. In the 1980s, our evolving understanding of what was needed to preserve the bay led to an expansion down to Little Hickory Island, bringing the preserve to its present 11,000 acres, all the way south to Bonita Beach Road. Today, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection's Florida Coastal Office manages the Aquatic Preserve Program. Becky Prado is the Deputy Director. She works with the Aquatic Preserve managers to oversee and maintain the areas.
So our aquatic preserve managers rely on citizens. They're advocates for our aquatic preserves. They're stewards for our aquatic preserves. They're the people that are boating on the waters, they're fishing on the waters, they're swimming on the waters, and so they're essential to all of our management activities. They help provide volunteers for the shorebird or the rookery monitoring, the seagrass monitoring, the water quality monitoring. They're helping educate the communities on the importance of the preserve. Some of them engage with our nonprofit organizations that they've established to help support the aquatic preserves. In Estero Bay, we have the Bay Buddies, and they help coordinate volunteers to help with cleanup events or with our monitoring. So we couldn't do any of it without the citizens and our volunteers.
The challenge for the next 50 years is to continue to recognize that protecting the bay involves protecting the water and the land upstream. If you look down on a watershed, the tributaries that feed the estuary look like the roots of a tree connecting the land to the sea, just as the roots connect the soil to the tree. A healthy tree needs functioning roots. Estero Bay needs tributaries that feed clean water in the correct amount with the correct timing. The watershed or drainage basin for Estero Bay spans nearly 360 square miles and is fed by 5 major rivers and creeks: Hendry Creek, Mulock Creek, Estero River, Spring Creek, and the Imperial River.
Well, basically, you need to protect the watershed because the quality of the estuary starts at the very top of the watershed and the highest of the uplands and the xeric scrubs and xeric pine flatwoods.
So all the activities that happen within the watershed affect the downstream waters. When you have agricultural activities or development activities happening upstream that are cutting off flow, that are introducing more pollution, all of that is going to collect and be conveyed downstream and ultimately going to affect the downstream receiving water. And that's what Estero Bay is, a downstream receiving water. So it's really where the rubber hits the road and you see all of the activities in the upper reaches of the watershed coming to fruition and how they impact the ecological health of the bay.
Conservation lands provide a myriad of ecosystem services. The water quality is cleaned by the vegetation in the soils, and it provides a cleaner water that goes to the estuary with a periodicity through a hydrology at the right time of the year to serve the fisheries that are in the harbor.
In the 1990s, the Estero Bay Buffer Preserve State Park was established to help protect the bay and has grown steadily with lands that were acquired through programs like CARL and now Florida Forever, and local programs like Lee County's Conservation 2020. These conservation lands are a critical buffer for the downstream waters of Estero Bay. To be a resident of Lee County is to be part of a legacy of public land preservation, the first aquatic preserve, the preservation of 6 Mile Cypress Slough, the establishment of the Lee County Conservation 2020 program, all show that Lee County residents have always valued public lands. But to be a resident of Lee County, you also experience growth. Since the establishment of the Aquatic Preserve, Lee County has grown from approximately 70,000 to over 700,000 people. The Conservancy's report card and the Estero Bay Agency on Bay Management's State of the Bay have documented a decline in water quality.
The Agency on Bay Management is a subcommittee of the Southwest Florida Regional Planning Council. The Agency on Bay Management was created about 20 years ago, and basically there had been a challenge to the permit to build Florida Gulf Coast University in its location, which is very environmentally sensitive at the headwaters of the Estero River. The State of the Bay is a recurrent evaluation of a number of different factors of Estero Bay by the Agency on Bay Management. It looks at hydrology, water quality, wildlife, fisheries, habitat, and human uses. Basically, some of the aspects of the bay are improving, particularly in areas of nutrients. Some of the areas are not improving, the hydrologic situation for the tributaries. Some of the fisheries are in definite decline, and we're seeing more problems with things like harmful algae blooms, and some of the listed species are disappearing.
Many agencies and organizations have their hands in the water and their feet on the lands surrounding the bay. Part of the mission of the Conservancy of Southwest Florida is to monitor the health of the ecosystems along our coast.
So every 5 to 6 years we do the Estuaries Report Card for Southwest Florida. It covers 10 watersheds in Southwest Florida, ranging all the way from Lemon Bay down to the 10,000 Islands. And Estero Bay watershed is one of those 10 watersheds that we assess. We look at water quality and hydrology. We also look at wildlife habitat, wetlands, conservation lands, and other indicators of ecological health. Well, the water quality, we still have a number of challenges where quite a big area in the watershed is not meeting state water quality standards. There are some plans underway already to help improve conditions, but we haven't really seen yet a lot of significant progress in improved water quality. But we also have new development and new challenges with stormwater runoff, agricultural runoff that could offset the gains that we're making in restoring the water qualities.
Certainly the bay has changed in the last 50 years. Most of us see declining water quality, fewer fish to catch, and more people on the water. But how much worse might it have been if the bay hadn't been protected?
If Estero Bay hadn't been protected as an aquatic preserve, and if the citizens of Lee County hadn't fought to protect it from developments, well, basically the water quality would be in horrible shape. There would be no mangroves around the eastern system. It would be turbid, it would lack the seagrasses, it would be horrible loss of fisheries. There would be very little water quality, and the people sitting in that urban waterfront would see brown, turbid, and unpleasant water in front of them.
One thing we have to understand, it requires effort to sustain what we love. Just like anything, neglect will usually result in it deteriorating. We have to put attention and resources towards protecting these things. If we want to sustain them, they will not do it on their own without our efforts.
Tarpon absolutely just tear these up. We're with the backcountry fly fishers. We try to do conservation projects when we can. We had a small group of about 6 fly fishermen that went out this morning on skiffs and kayaks to remove fishing line and trash from the mangrove islands. We went out to some areas that the aquatic preserve manager found if there were any active nests when we approached the islands. We went around the islands, particularly in kayaks, and removed any of the fishing line that we could find. We removed about 35 or 40 clusters of fishing line that were entangled in the limbs close to the water that could potentially catch wading birds, shorebirds, or other wildlife that might be utilizing these roosts and rookeries. The club likes to participate in conservation to provide some protection and give back to the resources. We get out and enjoy the resources regularly, so it's nice to be able to give back a little bit. We cleaned up about half a dozen of the mangrove islands, and we recorded it on GPS so that we can provide the managers with an estimate of how much linear feet of shoreline we cleaned. Individuals can have more of an impact than most people think they can have. Some of the trash that we pulled out of the waters today just blew off of boats because it wasn't secured. You have to treat things a little bit differently when you're out on the water.
Another group that gives back is eco-tour operators, and they also derive economic benefit from the bay. Tim Martell has been guiding people for 11 years, and he understands the importance of a natural balance.
Here in the state of Florida, we are so reliant on the tourism industry that we can't afford to have anything go wrong with these habitats. When people plan their vacations, they want to come to a place that's healthy and vibrant and thriving with life. Really, what it's all about for me is reconnecting people with the natural world, showing them when we work together, we can protect these areas, and it may sound cliche, but we can leave them for future generations. What we need to realize, it's not just about future generations, it's about our generation too.
There are many group stream projects that benefit Estero Bay. The FGCU Vesta Marine Research Station is making a creative oyster connection.
We've got a nice hockey connection going on here. I coach the D3 club. The boys were down here helping out with some of the other projects, and one of the guys came up with the idea of why don't we do something with these broken hockey sticks. These sticks are made out of a composite material. This carbon composite material is not recyclable in any way. So basically, these sticks are going right from the ice into a dumpster out to the landfills. So we're taking these, which would be otherwise non-recyclable materials, and we're recycling it to provide habitat for oysters. What we've created, they're basically broken hockey sticks that we build into these Lincoln log type structures. And these Lincoln log structures are then placed underneath commercial as well as residential docks. They'll be eventually encrusted with filter feeders such as sponges and oysters. And these sponges and oysters have incredible water filtration that allows some of these units to, they'll be able to filter quite a bit of water, and cleansing that water is a big thing for here local waterways such as Estero Bay. And it's not just the units going in the water, it's the education of why they're doing it is the most important thing. People have to have an understanding. And when we're talking about the understanding, let's talk about starting at the basics. And there's nothing more basic in the environment than the oyster. And when you start with the oyster, everything else will just fall into place.
As has always been the case, the health of the bay in the future will be tied to the people who care.
Basically, there's a wide variety of things people can do. Take the time to take a look at what your activity is doing and determine whether you think it's going to be good for the environment.
I mean, all of our bays in Florida have challenges. We have conflicting uses, but there are a lot of things that we can do.
Just making a good environmental choice as far as how you clean your home, making a good environmental choice in terms of how you fertilize your lawn.
All of those materials can collect in our waterways, and just like fertilizer grows green grass, when it gets into waterways it grows green algae. So if we don't want our waterways to turn green with algae, we need to be more careful with how we apply the fertilizers and how we use them.
If you're getting ready to buy a boat, or you already have a boat, you can look at those areas within the aquatic preserve that you like to visit and make sure that the size of your boat is appropriate so that you're not dragging on those submerged lands and resources.
The fishing line, most people can get in and remove fishing line when they get tangled in the mangroves, and it will prevent entanglements with wildlife.
And the best thing I think anybody can do is get out and enjoy the aquatic preserve. I mean, I think all of our bays and all of our estuaries need our visitors to see what's out there, to know what's worth protecting, and see where it is.
What I really would like to see is everybody see these many adventures. I've got stories I'll never forget. I like to have people beyond me to have stories never to forget.
So 50 years from now, what will Estero Bay look like? We can be pretty sure there'll be more people in the watershed, and we can be pretty sure that the preserve will be bigger because sea level's rising. 50 years from now, what will people think about us, the temporary stewards of this watershed? Will they honor our efforts or wonder why we ignored the issues? Since its establishment, the preserve has grown. The area in the watershed targeted for acquisition has grown. The human population and development within the watershed has exploded, but so has the number of people who care and the number of organizations guiding us towards a more sustainable future.
So 50 years from now, I want the citizens of Florida to be able to enjoy the exact same things that we get to enjoy within our aquatic preserves. I want them to be able to go out and catch fish. I want them to be able just to see the birds and the seagrasses just like we do today, if not even more expanded. I think the sky is the limit when we start looking at the future, and we can just continue to see improvements and continue to use the preserves.
That was a long time ago. Yeah.
Still making a difference today.
I guess so. We still got a bay.
We still got a bay.
Support for WGCU's local productions comes from the estate of Patrick and Rosalie LaSala and from generous contributions by viewers like you. Thank you. To include WGCU in your legacy planning, visit WGCU.org.